Hello and welcome to another discussion at Colaba Conversations. Coastal cities have always been the hub of economic activity. They've also been the center of geopolitical interest, but increasingly the arc in terms of how they track their own identity is changing and changing quite rapidly. They've gone beyond the traditional ideas of what a coastal city or an entrepot is about, and they've now started to efficiently deliver on logistical, managerial, and all other kinds of global trade services. But there are more weights on their shoulders as well, which is why it's important to see them as different from any other cities. What do they need in terms of infrastructure requirements? What kind of socioeconomic imperatives now circle these entrepôts? And more importantly, how do we build them to be both sustainable and scalable in the years to come? Let me introduce to you my panel that will discuss this issue at length and has lots and lots of insight to share. Claudia Warning, who's Director General of Asia, Middle East, and the Latin America market for the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development of Germany. Shirley Rodrigues, who's Deputy Mayor, Environment and Energy at Greater London Authority. Rafiq Dasani, who's Director of the RAND Center for Asia-Pacific Policy, and Ted Bellew, who's Honorary Enterprise Professor at Melbourne University and former Premier of Victoria. Welcome all of you. Thank you for joining in, making time out for this conversation. Let me start, if I may, with inviting you to make some opening comments, and perhaps we could then structure the conversation from there. Shirley, if we could start with you.
Good morning from London, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak at today's event. I should start by just saying, to clarify, obviously London isn't a coastal city as such, but we do share the infrastructure and resilience challenges of coastal cities, particularly due to climate change. And this is a really important year. 2021 is the year that the UK hosts COP26, and this is the decade to really kickstart action on the climate emergency. And we knew that ambition shown this year was going to be important. But given COVID, what we do this year and the ambition we set is doubly important for our recovery from the impacts of the pandemic. And we want to create a fair, green and prosperous global city. And so Sadiq Khan, who's the Mayor of London, was the first megacity mayor to declare a climate emergency. London was one of the first global cities to adopt and start implementing a 1.5-degree climate action plan compatible with the Paris Agreement. And last year, Sadiq set an ambition for London to go even further and to be zero carbon by 2030. And that's a very challenging target, but we know we can't fail future generations by at least not trying. And whilst we're accelerating action to reduce carbon emissions, we're also working to ensure London is resilient to its impacts. We're seeing daily the impacts of climate change globally. All of us on this call, but we're also seeing these impacts in our city too. And a key risk we share with coastal cities is sea level rise and tidal flooding. I'm glad to say that London is relatively well defended against tidal flooding throughout this century, partly because we have the Thames Barrier built in the 1980s, but we're still very vulnerable to other forms of flooding like river or surface water. We have approximately 1.5 million people living or working in areas of flood risk, and that includes lots of infrastructure, about 50 railway stations, 50 underground stations, 10 hospitals. So that's a big. Those are big impacts if they were affected. And of course, we are seeing sea level rise. But we've developed in 2012 a tidal flood risk management strategy, the Thames Estuary 2100 plan. We were one of the first cities in the world to have this plan, which was adaptive. So it takes an approach to monitor sea level rise and track indicators around it and river flows and changes to weather patterns. And then that triggers a different set of interventions depending on the rate of rise. And that's really helped us to really ensure that the Thames Barrier has a prolonged life. But we're undergoing a 10-year review at the moment to take account of new forecasts of sea level rise and to see whether we need to change that plan and that menu of action. And alongside of this, we also have a suite of strategies from our London Environment Strategy through to our spatial development plan, the plan that sets how new development in London is going to be built. And that really sets a strong policy framework for adaptation to climate impacts, in particular flooding. And through that, for example, we've safeguarded land for a possible new Thames Barrier, which is possibly needed in the 2070s. We're making sure that riverfront buildings have defences that meet those requirements out to 2100. But of course, the pandemic has caused us all to review and reconsider our plans. But far from deprioritising climate change, the Mayor Khan has been really clear that we have to tackle the climate emergency as part of our recovery from the pandemic, both our economic and social recovery. And we're working with a number of businesses, stakeholder groups, local authorities, communities on 9 missions to our economic and social recovery. And one of those is a Green New Deal mission, which aims to double the size of London's green economy by 2030 and accelerate job creation precisely by tackling the climate and ecological emergencies, improving air quality, and of course, resilience. And we're using resilience approaches, risk management and disaster risk reduction to make sure that we really understand what the impacts are and what the cascading impacts and interdependencies are. We know that extreme weather events don't take their turn, and they often happen together. So we can often have a flood during a heat wave, or even, for example, during a pandemic. And of course, just in conclusion, one of the things that we're doing is really working with other cities. So I'm really pleased to be part of this collaborative intervention because we all learn from each other. We all have different approaches, expertise and experience. We work, for example, through the C40 Connecting Delta Cities Network to really understand and share from each other so we don't reinvent the wheel. So finally, our commitment to adaptation and resilience is really a cornerstone of our recovery from COVID-19. And as I said, as we prepare for this year's Global Climate Conference, we're really going to be advocating to ensure that climate resilience is given prominence alongside carbon reduction. So thank you for allowing me to just give you a little bit of a flavour of what we're doing in London and the importance of these issues, and really look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Shirley, and for laying out the environmental responsibilities really that cities have at this point. Ted, if I could turn to you for your opening comments next.
Just very quickly, Charlie, I just want to give a little context to our discussion. The world is going big in the next 30 years to 2050, and we're adding 2-3 billion people, depending on the accuracy of the figures. And the most interesting thing about that is that the population growth is very uneven, and a very substantial portion of it is going to be in Africa and Asia. In fact, nearly an additional 2 billion people alone in Africa and South Asia. And East Asia, at the same time, is in somewhat of a decline population-wise. India goes to the top of the table soon. China is actually losing population, as is Japan in that period. And there's going to be in the process the shift of economic focus through the world to other regions. But if you look at India alone adding some 350 plus million people in that time, which is nearly 15 to 16, 17 Australias. And it means virtually a million million extra jobs every month for 30 years. It's a huge challenge. And it's a challenge that has to be met because the price of not meeting it is too high. And just looking at average ages, average age in Japan, 47 at the moment, going up in the future. China, US, Australia, Europe, around about 38. India, 10 years younger at 28. Pakistan, younger still at 23, 24. And Nigeria and so much of Africa, younger still. Nigeria, which is going up to the top of the table in ahead of the US in population, not too distant future. There is going to be this huge shift, and it's a big shift. They're big numbers and they're big changes. And if you look at that corridor, Pakistan through to Australia, adding 640 million people in that time, and Africa 1.3. And as I said at the start, nearly 2 billion people around the Indian Ocean region alone. And all of that puts what we're doing into context, this discussion into context. And for India, in particular, it means increased population, it means growing economy, it means increased influence, and it's going to require a much more open and more accountable India. And I take the view that that massive change is such that failure is just going to be unacceptable. And the changes, the reforms that are necessary are going to be inevitable. They simply have to happen. And there's a big disruption going on. And we've seen that already in the US. We've seen it in all sorts of areas, big tech, big finance, big media, the big challenges, obviously the pandemic. No matter what we make of that, it's a big challenge. Big continental alliances, big manufacturing, big agriculture, and there are going to need to be big solutions. And the big future of coastal cities is nevertheless still based on the assumption that trade in goods and commodities is going to continue to be both free and a dominant component of national economies, and it's going to have a strong rules-based multilateralism at its core. Now, in terms of goods and commodities, just in India alone, around 50% of the economy's services. So whilst we make these assumptions, as we're discovering, anything can change across the world. But my assumption is that, that trade will continue to have a focus. And I note that India, under the current government, has embarked on many big changes and many big reforms, all with big labels now, whether it's banking, taxation, roads, rail, utilities, farming, and other port developments as well. And India, of course, has embarked in port development on the Sagamala project, which is effectively an amalgam of many projects over many years. But it's generally, in my view, on the right track. But the challenge for India, and indeed the challenge for all entrepôts, and if we're talking about entrepôts, they are the very big ports, the ones that service all the needs. So we're talking about the big ports with big challenges in a big world, in a big and changing environment. But the big challenge for India in particular, the Sagamala, is delivery and getting the strategy right. And I think in many cases, whether it's Indonesian nations or some of these big collaborative efforts, that's still the big challenge, getting it right.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for that. That's fascinating. And I think we've got two really strong pillars on this conversation already. There's environmental objectives, and then there's people and infrastructure. Claudia, I'm going to turn to you for your opening comments now, and what your sense is of the big challenges ahead.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. I think my speakers before me have already carved out a few of the challenges and also the opportunities we are seeing in coastal cities. You have already said coastal cities are vibrant, and they are essential for a country to connect to the world and for the economy. If you see Mumbai, it has been for decades the motor of the Indian economy. So absolutely necessary that we have a very close look to that. And if we see the challenges ahead, and if we see the agendas we have been pursuing, like the sustainable development goals, like poverty reduction, you can't do that without the cities, and as Ted has already laid it out. If we see at the environmental challenges, we have to solve them not also in cities, we have mainly to solve them in cities. That is one of the reasons why the German government and the Indian government, both together, have decided that our cooperation in development is very much along the lines of sustainable urban development, responding to the needs of the urban poor, achieving the SDGs, and mitigating and adapting to climate change. For that, we have particularly established the Indo-German Partnership for Green Urban Mobility. Just recently, we have launched it, and this partnership is committed to sustainable transformation and evolution of cities, and to make a major contribution to improved air quality, road safety, affordable access to traffic, and to low emission public transport, especially for the urban cores of the cities. Cities are at the crossroads of communication and exchange of goods, and need to improve sustainable, mobility of people as well as of goods and services. And this is particularly important for coastal cities, very clearly. Our development policy advocates to strengthening the public transport modes that protect the environment on the one hand and still give people access to services and a source of income. Traffic in cities should be organized in a sustainable and yet intelligent way. As part of the financial cooperation, our development bank, KfW, has provided more than 2 billion euros since 2013 for sustainable climate-friendly urban mobility projects. Among these are very prominent that we are financing part of the urban metro system with elements, and that is very important, with elements of multimodal integration and non-motorized transport. We also have financed part of the Napro metro, not a coastal city, but still it comes in the same line. And the conversation of bus fleets to cleaner fuel options and e-buses, especially in the cities of Tamil Nadu, also a very coastal state, and Chennai is, I think, one of the biggest city which you have along your coastline. And for sure in Kochi, it's important to look at the water transport. So we have financed the water metro in Kochi as well. By technical cooperation, that means working together with the experts and technicians, we managed to improve bus services in Bhubaneswar and train key personnel at national and local levels, preparing the introduction of e-buses all over India. We also achieved the modification of roads as per the principles of complete street design. Beyond the question of urban mobility, coastal cities need support also in adapting to climate change. We have dedicated, therefore, over 500 million euros to foster urban resilience and water security and build robust urban infrastructure in small and medium coastal cities through urban development funds in Odisha and Tamil Nadu. Further, by financing the sewage network, also very important for coastal cities, but also in other cities. And we did that in Haridwar and Rishikesh, and therefore helped to clean the river Ganga, which again goes into the Bay of Bengal and also is interconnected with the cities along its line and the bay. So you see from this little bit of insight in our cooperation with the Indian government that we are trying to look at traffic, at urban infrastructure, and trying to make them adaptable to the climate change, and thus also trying to do the necessary inputs that cities can contribute to keep us below the 2 Celsius degree line, which we need to tackle. So altogether, I think we can't, as Ted already said, it has to happen. It's not an option. It is a must. And this is what we try in our cooperation with India. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia, for sharing those great examples. And you're absolutely right. I think city design is another key vertical of this conversation, for us to have. Rafiq, last word in terms of the opening comments from you.
Thank you, Mithali. And good morning or good day to everyone. It's nighttime for me, as you can see, in Los Angeles. But I'm very happy to be here with you all. So I think the issue of coastal cities, from my point of view as an economist, is to ask the question, do we really need coastal cities for growth? Historically, because of the preponderance of goods traffic that was only possible to send through ships in the old days, and I say old days going back 20, 25 years, so not that far back. The coastal city made sense for every country to focus on as an engine of growth. But at least in rich countries, that has started to change, and the engines of growth are no longer necessarily in the coastal cities. The area where I live, for example, Los Angeles, has long been overtaken by a non-coastal area, Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley itself developed in opposition initially to San Francisco, where there was a feeling that there was no need to be in San Francisco. It was better to go into the valley. And so the whole shift to services has raised the issue of the coastal city for richer countries as engines of growth. Now, for poorer countries or developing countries, of which India is one, most of Asia, developing countries, the argument might be different because they still want to develop a goods profile. And in that context, I think we can look at the Belt and Road Initiative as a key learning opportunity. So what is it that the Belt and Road Initiative, they've done many things right, some things wrong, but you can see clearly the focus on the coast, at least in half of the Belt and Road Initiative, the Maritime Silk Road, which focuses on ports development. There's a very strong emphasis on developing coastal areas, but these are not necessarily large coastal cities. I mean, Gwadar rather than Karachi, for example, in Pakistan, the port of Kyaukphyu rather than Yangon in Myanmar. So what you have in the Belt and Road Initiative, I think, is a very pretty useful learning, that if you can take an area which has some obvious potential in terms of connectivity or potential connectivity, and then provide the connectivity both to the outside world through the port as well as to inside the country through rail and road links, you can actually make coastal cities work. That said, the upper half of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the part that goes from China through Central Asia to Europe, is really not a coastal initiative, and that's been equally successful. And a lot of that has to do with just providing very good infrastructure. So the lesson I take away from the BRI is that the availability of capital is key, the availability of implementation of projects in time and in good quality, something that India has long struggled with, is key. But it doesn't necessarily have to be coastally linked. There's an argument for coastal cities, but not an overwhelming one or an exclusive one. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Rafiq. And I think that closes up the quad quite perfectly in terms of talking about finance as well. Ted, let me pick up on the point that Rafiq made and ask you this with respect to both infrastructure planning as also examples. I mean, if you look at Dubai, for example, it's a classic case of scalability, is it not? Where massive oil revenues were invested on port and trade infrastructures. You then went on to build a logistics city, but you also put trade policies in place. As a result, you had not just local, but also regional and then global significance for the city. Is that the sort of track that coastal cities should vie for when they're trying to build scalability in infrastructure?
Well, it's a good point that Rafiq make, and a good question you ask, Mitali, because there's no use every coastal city trying to do the same thing. And the key entrepots, and Dubai isn't one of the biggest ports in the world by any means, but the key ones have sovereign control and they have a very defined purpose and a strategy that goes with it. And that's what's needed in any broad development of entrepôts. And this discussion is meant to be focused on entrepôts, and hence we're looking at the big ports. The other ports probably fit more into Rafiq's category. And when it comes to India in particular, there's a particular issue around transshipment where goods, containers come to India and then get on, then are shifted to smaller ships which distribute them to the other coastal ports. And that comes at some cost. So there are issues where that transshipment best takes place and whether it's via rail or road or by smaller local shipping is a key question, but the strategy has to be right in the first place. It has to be a national strategy. And I think if you're going to preserve the best of trade, then whilst greenfield ports, the development of greenfield entrepreneurs is going to require national expenditure, that can still be done with private investment and investment from trading partners in particular who have an investment in the long-term success of those ports. But there has to be a defined purpose, and the purpose has got to include strategies around finance, around the environment, around the development of other components of the land attached to the port, and to pick up all the issues which Rafiq so beautifully summarised. You can't have one of these big container ships turn up in any river. They've got to go to key locations, and it's the key question for any nation is, where are their key locations? And there are two giant ports in the US, and they barely make the top 20 in the world. One's on the East Coast and one's on the West Coast, and that makes sense. One in Florida, one in California, and that makes sense. But not everybody's trying to be an entrepot.
Shelley, I want to go back to the point you made about environmental objectives at this point, but with a post-2020 lens, if you may. It's well documented that for cities, there are critical challenges in terms of pollution, congestion, safety, but equally, I think COVID was sort of a day of reckoning in terms of the importance of these nodal points as shipment points. Deliveries could not stop despite containment measures because it was essential to carry forward to other cities and to other geographies. Any big learnings post-COVID, you think, for cities such as London and for other coastal cities as well?
Well, I think it's some of the points that others have made, like Ted and Rafiq, that you have to think about how you want your city to be. And COVID has really highlighted, certainly in London, and I'm sure many other cities as well, that, the problems around air pollution, congestion, and so on. So people have seen what a livable city could be like, but they still need services to be delivered, their goods to be delivered, and so on. And I think with the imperatives on the environment, again, tackling air pollution, we have very toxic air in London that the Mayor Sadiq Khan has been working very hard, and we've seen huge reductions in air pollution because we brought in environmental initiatives like our Central London ultra low emission zone. These are things like climate change, for example, that I've mentioned in my opening remarks. These are things that citizens are demanding that we take action on. So in looking at how we ensure our economy recovers, we also have to tackle environment. And that also means working with businesses to see how they might deliver goods and services in a more environmentally friendly way. I mean, in London, we were once a port city, and we have transformed into a service-based economy, largely through financial services in the City of London. But we are dependent on the rest of the country for goods coming in, Dover and other ports as well. So, we are part of an interconnected system, and I think that's the other thing to remember is how do we work with other cities within the UK and obviously across to Europe that we're dependent on. But ultimately, I think, I mentioned again in my remarks, we cannot have a recovery from COVID without really looking at how environment issues are tackled, because they are not just environmental issues, they're economical issues, they're issues to do with the economy, but also our health and well-being.
Rafiq, just to pick up on the point you raised earlier about relooking the identity or very role of these coastal cities as well, what about an example like Singapore that has also sort of metamorphosed itself into an entrepot for financing of inter-regional trade? So, there's a rethinking of ideas, but of economic ideas as well, not just the nuts and bolts of logistics and trade movement.
Hey, you're quite right. I mean, Singapore, particularly in what's called offshore finance, has been a pioneer. And so is Hong Kong. But they're both leveraging off China in some ways. China has been slow to develop its own financial systems. And so that allows Singapore and Hong Kong to do that. If you look at, say, Mumbai, for example, can it develop as a center of finance I mean, it is already a domestic center of finance. And I know that very well. I used to be a stockbroker on the Mumbai Stock Exchange many years ago. But, you know, as a center of global finance, either for the region or for the Asia-Pacific more broadly, long way to go. And it's not clear that that being a coastal city will give it that advantage. You know, I think you need much more than location. You need rules, for example, on capital convertibility. You need rules on regulation of debt. You know, India has problems with each of these issues. So I would say, in addition to the infrastructure, the regulatory environment is key. I mean, Singapore has a tough regulatory environment that gives investors a lot of confidence.
Claudia, there are problems within the cities themselves in terms of how they're spreading and growing. There's finance, as was pointed out, but equally there is the challenge of the blue economy. I mean, you were talking about partnerships. Do you think this is the time to work out both more cohesive blue economy frameworks and for countries to sort of, trade more information and know-how in terms of how to find that delicate balance between, things like tourism on the one hand, but also ecological responsibilities on the other?
Sorry, Mithali, can you define blue economy? It comes with different meanings. So what do you mean by it?
I will come to you, Rafiq. The question was actually for Claudia. Claudia, if my question was...
No, I just wanted a definition of blue economy. What is it?
I'm talking about using the sustainable use of ocean resources, really, where you're balancing economic growth with your responsibilities for the underlying or the adjoining environment. Claudia, if I could have your thoughts on that first.
Well, I think I have to disappoint you a little bit because I'm not sure whether, let's say, the big coastal cities would be the right one to tap on the resources of the blue economy. If you see Mumbai, if you see Jakarta, if you see Hong Kong, they all have problems with, let's say, the blue resources because actually right now what they are doing is they are challenged by, let's say, the threats of these resources. Jakarta is sinking into the ocean by more than a meter in a decade. So, as well as other coastal cities. So I'm not really sure whether that would be the right way to go for a coastal city in order to, let's say, convert their business model. Maybe other cities at the coastal lines, which are not as big as those which I've mentioned, could tap on these resources and trying to use that. Yet, I think that the challenge is just the other way around. So how do they handle the environmental challenges coming from the ocean by rising sea levels? And on the other hand, how can they protect the resources of the ocean, because most of the pollution of the oceans come from the land side. So you see that in India, you see that in China. I think Asia is a good place to discuss this issue. And we have to see that we protect these resources of the blue oceans, and especially that the big coastal cities would protect it and see that they clean up whatever they bring into the ocean and destroy these resources around. So I'm not sure whether this would be really a good economic transformation. But as Rafiq has said, and I would like to dwell on that, if we talk about coastal cities, the bigger ones, we think of, going to the world. But if you take Dubai doesn't have a hinterland, but Mumbai has it, Jakarta has it. So the question is, how do you access whatever is at the other end of the coastal cities in their lands? And you see that very, very properly in Pune or Bombay. Yeah. So Pune is growing a lot in the last decades, and Bombay is giving the access for Pune to bring their productions to the ocean and then ship it and connect to the world economy. So it needs this. It needs a holistic look at it and to see what is around the coastal cities, and what else can you do? And the Road and Belt initiative ends actually here in Germany in a inland port. Yeah, so Duisburg is the end in Germany of the Road and Belt. So it's again connected to water-based infrastructure. So at the end, you need to find the connection between both.
Ted, I'd like you to come in on that, because the whole concept of the Belt and Road has really brought geopolitics to the fore. Is that, or should that be an imperative? You think building greater maritime cooperation, working on building greater geopolitical connections?
Oh, thanks, Natalie. Belt and Road is interesting because it's really an assembly of projects, many of which have been going on for some time. And the Chinese have reached out to a lot of African nations and other nations and sought to assist in the construction of projects and the development of land. They haven't always got it right. They haven't always won over local communities. And we shouldn't assume that these big initiatives are always successful. The ingredients of a successful project are going to be 1, financial, 2, environmental, 3, they're going to win over local community, and they're going to serve a need which is a local need. And so it's easy to concentrate on the headlines around Belt and Road and to concentrate on some apprehensions about it. But when you look at other initiatives, they too are the assembly of projects which have been on the cards for a while. The Sagamala in India, if you look at the projects in Tamil Nadu, and one of the key projects down there at Ennayam, that has been on the cards for years and is still yet to get up and running as a major port. But there's been a lot of money spent on it in the hope that it will. While the private sector not far away have put together their own big port. And that's a classic unfortunate contest. And along the way, there's been a lot of disruption. But I go back to where I started from. The challenges are so enormous. And whilst there will be service economies that provide growth in all sorts of areas, there will be this fundamental change. And the shift is going to be to these very big trades and these big locations with the big decisions. And the question for any nation, any authority is, what do they want of that? And what do they believe they can pass over, and where should it be? And I know mention was made of Mumbai before. Well, Mumbai's port is being effectively replaced by the new port being built to the north. And that will have the hinterland which is needed and have the deep access, albeit it's going to be a dredged access, which is not as good as a more reliable undredged access that was available in the south. The challenges are huge. They're complex issues. No one's got them right, but they need good governance, they need good finance, and they're going to need a lot of partnerships with experienced people just to produce the capacity to make them happen.
Rafiq, what would you say should be the number one priority for India while planning its coastal cities, given the geopolitics and given the geoeconomic architecture we have going around the Indo-Pacific right now?
India's tried to make certain partnerships. As you mentioned in your brief on the project, there's a supply chain resilience initiative, the Asia-Africa growth corridor. All of these are efforts by India to offset its shortage of capital with its adequacy of technical skills, to leverage someone else's capital and their own technical skills to implement large projects that can, have an impact for India and for the recipient countries. It's still an open question whether this is a good strategy or not. It's so far, if you look at the Africa initiative, for example, Asia-Africa, it hasn't really gone anywhere. was announced about 10, 12 years ago, and it's still where it was, So I think it requires a little more than just capital and skills. It requires a certain level of political commitment to make these sorts of things happen. And political commitment in a geopolitical sense means, if it's Japan and India working together in Africa, there has to be a binding commitment which the Japanese, for example, have never been keen to do, which is that they will provide the capital and India will provide, and some other country will provide the skills. They want to do it all themselves because they have the skills, they have the capital. So that's where the geopolitics and domestic politics don't always mix too well. So it's a challenge, I think. We don't really know any easy ways out.
Very true. I am mindful of time. I think we've only got about a minute to go. Shirley, final word with you, because ultimately, it does boil down to sustainable practices. What is it that we can put in place and go on from generation to generation? What would you say at this point are the 2 or 3 things that all coastal cities or cities such as yours should keep in mind while drafting and honoring sustainable practices?
So just picking up some of the threads that people have mentioned already, the impact of COVID has been particularly felt, certainly in London, on young people, and we've seen Ted talking about the sort of younger population, particularly in Asian countries. And obviously that unemployment means that we've got to think about where are the new jobs. And in London, but not just in London, through the C40, we've been working with over 100 cities, all of whom signed up to a Green New Deal, recognising the future is in the green economy, and how do we ensure that the new economy really reflects our concerns, citizens' concerns about air pollution, climate change, adaptation to climate impacts, and nature. So the impact the cities have on its oceans, but also and its hinterland, are really a big opportunity, which is why we've been really focusing on doubling the size of London's green economy. And I think that's really what all cities, including coastal cities, should really be thinking about as we all look to coming out of COVID and looking to an economic social recovery that has to be a green recovery. And in particular this year, this decade rather, of action on climate change, really important.
Wonderful. My thanks to all of you for taking time out across different time zones and joining in for this conversation. Perhaps next year we'll all be in person, both in Colaba and in Mumbai by extension, talking about this. But thank you very much for weighing in with your thoughts today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good, great moderation.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.